Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and welcome to part 3 of our exploration of Asian horror films released in 2016. Now most of the films we're covering tonight I think are worth a watch. Most are from Japan, but we also have one from Thailand, one from South Korea, and one from Laos. And remember, titles for all the movies I discuss will be listed in the description box below. Now our first film tonight is technically a Thai production, but it has a Japanese flair to it, and that is Buppha Rahtree, Haunting in Japan. This is a Thai horror comedy. In the middle of white winter, a group of young Thai men visit the countryside in Japan to shoot a music video. However, the house that they have rented is haunted by several ghosts. There's a pair of mother and child ghosts with pale faces. Then there's a mysterious Thai woman who floats around sadly, looking neither alive nor dead. So this is the 5th Rahtree movie that I've reviewed in this playlist. We already covered Rahtree Flower of the Night from 2003, Rahtree Returns from 2005, Rahtree 3.1 from 2009, and Rahtree 3.2 from 2009. So you may be surprised to know that Haunting in Japan is actually from the same director who did the original Rahtree film as well as some of the sequels. It has that odd blend of horror and comedy that this director has a knack for. However, you do need maybe a little bit of patience with this one. Now, it has a good opening that establishes the snowy winter setting. The chilly environment does add some atmosphere from start to finish, and there are not many Thai horror films that take place in the snow. That's for sure. It also helps to make the very limited locations more pleasing on the eyes. Now, there's a certain intensity and creepiness to this that most viewers will not expect, especially if you watch like the trailers or some of the promotional material. But there are also a few laugh-out-loud moments, one of which is an answer to the question, am I dead? Now, there are a few jump scares in this, but they did not irritate me as much as usual, probably because the sound design in this movie and the scoring are executed with like a sustained intensity and moodiness. So it's a little bit more aggressive in its sound design overall, so I guess the jump scares really didn't pop out that much. The Onryo has a traditional Japanese no mask for a face. Pretty cool. She also wields a big knife and is rather deadly. This is kind of a good example of how genre cliches can be used in odd but entertaining ways. You know, we've seen some of these elements before, but because this is a Thai horror comedy from a director who could kind of blend genres a little bit, it feels a little bit different. Some of the other horror elements are good, like the throat cut scene is one highlight. Now, at one point in the film, 2 exorcists show up and contribute a fairly long sequence in the house, which ends in kind of an awkwardly creepy and humorous moment. It reminded me in some ways of the original Rahtree Flower of the Night. And there's also a scene involving umbrellas and underwear, which is quite amusing. And then we have a finale, which lasts quite a while and has some unpredictable elements. You know, the humor in this film at times gets a little bit goofy, but it still works. The story is a little bit choppy. I didn't think it flowed that well. A little bit confusing at times as well. I thought the script was a little bit on the messy side in this one, but the sharp cutting between characters and time periods does make it engaging. It also makes the movie feel a little bit different. So if you've enjoyed some of the prior films in the Rahtree franchise, you'll probably like this one as well. If you have seen all of them, some of them are kind of tough to find nowadays, but if you have seen all of them, let me know which one is your favorite and where this one would rank on your list. This is a pretty good flick, but newcomers to the franchise should probably watch the original film first. All right? DVD availability. This one nowadays is difficult to find. I think this was one of those like Cineflix rentals I had way back in the day, like 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So nowadays it's kind of tough to find, unfortunately. If you could find it though, give it a shot. Alright, our next film here is called Hide and Never Seek. This is a Korean horror film, of course, from 2016. A broadcaster of live horror-themed streams looks for more provocative and fearful material for his show. He receives a video which contains a female high school student who plays hide-and-go-seek by herself. She disappears right after calling a ghost. He decides to investigate, and he travels to the abandoned building from which she disappeared. Now, this film begins with our protagonist who narrates some footage regarding a spiritualist who successfully found a dead body of a missing girl. But the protagonist in our film here is not convinced of supernatural ability, and he concludes that the spiritualist was lucky to find the body near the girl's home because of the incompetency of local police who failed to do their job. He goes to investigate that event, and that represents your opening 20 minutes. It's kind of like a setup subplot to introduce us to our main character and like his show that he's doing. After that, we get our main plot, and he moves on, and he gets frustrated that he has no decent leads to follow for interesting material, and that's when he gets this video of the schoolgirl playing hide-and-seek with ghosts in a library washroom, which is similar in many ways to the Japanese movie Creepy Hide-and-Seek, which I covered previously in this playlist. So basically we follow this guy and his producer, and the enjoyability of the movie is going to be dependent on whether or not you think this main protagonist is engaging enough to hold your interest. I could see some people maybe getting irritated by this guy. I think he's interesting enough, despite the fact that he's got a massive ego. Like, the dude has an attitude problem. But it's almost like, I found his cockiness to be amusing, because he's going to get the crap scared out of him later in the film, at the very least, if not have his life in danger. So it's kind of satisfying. So even if you don't like this guy, there might be a reason to keep watching. Now, pacing is a little bit on the slow side. You don't see much in terms of the ghosts. Very low key. But it's only like 88 minutes long, and the finale lasts about 25 minutes, and it kind of ramps up the tension to a decent amount near the end. So I would say that the ending was satisfying, and it creeped me out a little bit. It was a little bit creepy, I thought. So I think this is one where, like, fans of found footage horror may want to check this one out. I think it's a pretty good flick. So Hide and Never Seek is actually available on Tubi for free. All right, we've come to a, how can I say this? A very recognizable film, we'll put it that way. We finally come to the Japanese horror film that has received the most attention in the last 15 years. 15 to 20 years, I would say. Did it deserve all of that attention? Probably not. And of course, I'm talking about Sadako versus Kayako, and Japanese horror film, of course. So, a social worker visits the residence of an elderly woman, only to find her strangled by an electric cord. A nearby video player suddenly turns on and plays the cursed videotape. Sadako kills the social worker. The video player is sold at a shop and bought by 2 university students. When they find the cursed videotape inside, they play it. The footage has upgraded, displaying a decrepit building instead of the usual well, and the curse deadline has been reduced to 2 days. Afterward, they receive a disturbing phone call as Sadako manifests, and after being cursed by her, they are convinced by a spiritual medium to use Kayako to stay alive. Now, this film was directed by Koji Shiraishi, a man who exhibits much creativity in his films. If you're at all familiar in this playlist, you know this fact because we've covered an insane number of this man's films over the past handful of years. It seems like every other video I'm reviewing a Koji Shiraishi film, and here we are again. Shiraishi is a director whose films are frequently rough around the edges. Okay, he usually works with very low budgets. The CGI is usually terrible, but he has more creativity in his pinky finger than many horror directors out there today. Now, unfortunately, that inspiration is lacking in Sadako vs. Kayako because the story plays out in a fairly predictable manner. There's not many surprises in this one, which is really disappointing given the director. I don't know if maybe the studio execs were like, listen, you can't do that crazy stuff in your low-budget horror movies because we're dealing with two big franchises here. Maybe I can only imagine that that's the reason. They kind of squashed him, you know what I mean, in terms of his options and freedom, creative freedom. But I don't know that. But that's what I assume. But still, I did enjoy this film more after a very recent second viewing. And it's probably the best Japanese Sadako film since Ring Zero. It's not saying much, but it probably is. So there is a little bit of filler to sit through in between the horror, resulting in a slightly lethargic experience. The plot synopsis references an upgraded tape with different effects, but I don't remember that being directly referenced in the film. Like, why exactly was the time period changed? And I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I kind of wish they expanded on that a little bit. The rule changes seemed a little bit unjustified to a degree. But I did like the brief discussion near the start of the film on urban legends in the internet era. But with that said, there is enough horror content in a few moments near the end that are genuinely amusing. You know, the opening scare with Sadako is brief, decent. Sadako shows up briefly again by the 15-minute mark. And then there's an entertaining scene involving little kids, including some bullies, who go into a haunted house with Kayako and Toshio in it. And that scene has some balls, which is a good thing. First time the videotape is actually played, they only show like a few seconds of it, which is an odd choice. Just play the whole thing, you know what I mean? Then somebody else watches the tape, they only show a few seconds of it. So at this point you're like, come on, these images better be pretty darn good. You're teasing it a lot here. And when we finally see the tape near the midpoint, it's fine. You know, it's a fine tape, but again, it's lacking in any type of real creativity there. We get an extended scene with Sadako murdering someone. Pretty good scene. Very in line with this franchise. And then the finale is pretty good. It has a few splashes of creativity right at the end. Production values are good. Opens with some nice bluish visuals. Film is nicely lit. I like how the film is shot. The color's not outlandish or gaudy, but it's nicely applied. The nighttime scenes are lit very well, I thought. Tina Tamashiro, who starred in the live-action adaptation of Hellgirl, also directed by Koji Shiraishi and way better than this movie, she shows up early and gets a good amount of screen time in this. Masanobu Ando shows up near the midpoint with his little blind girl assistant. He's a dude with, like, psychic powers. He has a bit of an attitude. Reminded me a little bit of that guy from the blonde-haired dude from Cult, another Koji Shiraishi film. But his presence adds a little bit of quirkiness to the film, which is good. So I think Sadako vs. Kayako, overall, I do think that it's kind of moderately entertaining, but it's also a disappointment considering the director who's at the helm here. Certainly better than any of the recent Sadako films, alright? So it's alright. It's pretty good. And this is available on Shudder, as well as a few other streaming sites. Now, the next few films, I would say, are maybe a little bit of an upgrade, I would think. Our next few films, okay, are from a Japanese director who I've talked about fairly recently, too. Last October, I did a special video where I talked about, where are all the Japanese horror films nowadays, and I specifically mentioned this guy. And he is in desperate need for more international exposure. And these first few films we're talking about here are called Dorome 1 and 2, Girls' Side and Boys' Side. Both films released in 2016, Japanese horror. The story follows a joint training camp between two drama clubs from an all-boys high school class and an all-girls high school class. Now, there are apparently only 8 teams who are attending this drama club on this particular day. So there's only 8 kids here. One of these movies is depicted from the standpoint of the girls, and the other movie is depicted from the standpoint of the boys. Now, one of the schoolboys is being stalked by a ghost woman who's dressed in red. Meanwhile, the schoolgirls see a missing person poster of a girl, and then they see the local shrine statue has been decapitated. So both of these mysterious events could lead to some supernatural problems for all of our protagonists. So this was directed by Eisuke Naito, the same man who gave us Puzzle and Liverleaf, 2 of the best Japanese horror films from the last decade. Dorome, Girls and Boys is not as awesome as those films, but it is worth watching. Now the pacing is a bit slow during the opening half, but I do like some of the interaction between these characters. You know, the girls and the boys get together, they play a game where one of them's blindfolded, and another person attempts to verbally guide them through a series of obstacles that are made from like orchestra instruments in a classroom. It's a nice little scene of like bonding and stuff. I like that. They also shoot off some fireworks, I think, off the rooftop. So this interaction, it's nothing great, but it's certainly more engaging than the films we covered in part 1 of this 2016 playlist. So remember though, these are 2 different movies that we're talking about here. All right, girls' side and boys' side, and there's a lot of intersection points with both films. There are some scenes that repeat in both films that overlap, but there's also scenes that show events that are not in the other films. So you need to watch both films to get the complete picture here. An interesting little gimmick, because each movie gives you pieces to the overall story. Now, in terms of horror, there's a rotting spot on the wall that's a fun little scare. You might be thinking, oh, it's just like dark water or something. It starts that way, but it doesn't end that way. I'll put it that way. There's a mud ghost that's in this who can shift between wet and solid forms, and it also kills people by vomiting blood onto their faces. Remember, this is, if you've seen this director's other films, you know it's going to get a little nutty, all right? Certainly a different kind of supernatural entity that contributes a handful of bizarre moments and makes these films memorable. The horror content certainly kind of livens up during the second half of each of these films, and when all is said and done, I think they're pretty fun. The humor is not as goofy as you might expect, given the promotional material, but I found that the humor primarily derived from the mud ghost, who's kind of slow and weak. Like, it's not that intimidating of a ghost, but it's amusing kind of because of that. And the weapons that some of the students use against it near the end, it's pretty funny. But remember, it's Eisuke Naito, so there's going to be some quirkiness and oddities present. Not as funny as The Crone, another Naito film, which is hilarious, but this does have its moments. Visuals are decent for a lower budget production, limited locations. The entire film takes place on school grounds, basically. There's a little bit of atmosphere in terms of windy forest in a slightly cooler time of year. The films are 98 minutes long for girls' side, 92 minutes long for boys' side. Now, this is what I did. Little bit of a bizarre viewing experience. Okay, but if you have like 2 TVs or a TV and a computer that can play, DVDs or whatever, or movies, try watching both films at the same time on 2 different screens. The girls' side and the boys' side. Very interesting experience. They don't, obviously the scenes that overlap do not line up perfectly, but it's pretty interesting to like watch both films, and you get that kind of comparison. You see the overlapping moments, and you see the things that are different and stuff like that. So it's a pretty interesting gimmick. You don't see this very often at all with any types of movies, right? So I did view this without subtitles. I don't think these are available with subtitles yet, but the story's pretty easy to follow. Now these, unfortunately, both of these are available on Region 2 DVD, no subtitles. If you could find like a Taiwanese DVD that's cheaper, get that. But unfortunately, a lot of this director's films are just tough to find. It's really frustrating. But this is another one of his that's worth watching. Then we have another one from Eisuke Naito, another film. Litchi Hikari Club, a Japanese horror drama. The following synopsis was borrowed from The Hollywood Reporter. I think they do a good job summarizing this. Quote, Litchi Hikari Club starts with a classic genre film moment. A dude in a rubber suit, dripping with KY jelly. He's the imaginary friend of insular elementary school boy Sunekawa, who clearly has an overactive imagination. Years later, Sunekawa has morphed into Zera, a fascistic middle school cult leader hell-bent on eliminating the filthy scourge of Keiko Town, adults. Youth and beauty are the order of the day. This is Fight Club with way more rules, 10 to be exact, and the next great moment comes in the pursuit with nail guns as the weapon of choice. The club finds a woman on the street and make an example of of her, and the gore begins. It ends miserably for everyone, unquote. So yeah, it's just another weird one from this director. And this one is really kind of oddball. I mean, we basically have 9 boys who resist becoming ugly adults. They obtain the strongest power and eternal beauty, apparently, from their cultish behavior. And they also become crazy. So these nutcase cultists are in uniforms. They occasionally speak German. I'm not joking. They kidnap a girl who stumbles upon their hideout, and it goes from there. Now, this is actually based off of a manga, believe it or not. And it's weird right from the start. I mean, like, we get that opening scene that they mentioned in their plot synopsis. Little kid in a room with occult decorations. He's tinkering with tools, and there's a large, slimy red monster behind him who tells him that he must rule all of humankind. All right? Then we immediately cut to him as an adult, leading a cult, who chases a woman with a nail gun and captures her. And the characters introduce themselves, they explain how they want to torture the girl, etc. And then there's a gory torture scene early on that sets the tone. But then, get this, they build an archaic-looking robot that's designed specifically to kidnap more women. So yeah, there's a robot in this movie. Yes. It kind of reminded me a little bit of, remember that robot in Judge Dredd, the Stallone movie, where it's all like practical effects? It kind of reminded me of that. Not as cool as that robot, but it's pretty neat. This movie has quite a few surprises and creativity that it makes it unorthodox and memorable. Lots of focus on the interaction between the cult members, as well as between the robot and the second kidnapped girl. Visuals incorporate lots of industrial buildings and smog. Kind of neat for a horror film. You know, it has a claustrophobic vibe. There's practically no bright sunlight for the entire movie. Most of it's either shot indoors or outside at night or on cloudy days. So, and like I said, the robot itself is made from practical effects, which is actually really cool. Definitely a highlight special effect in this. There are a few kind of sleazy, perverted moments in this. One of which leads to a pretty funny shot. There are a few moments that are a little bit kind of gross, but those scenes are fairly short. There are a few good death scenes, though, to enjoy as well. One of the actresses from Fatal Frame, the live-action film, is also in this, which is neat to see. So if you like that movie, you get to see one of those actresses here in a big role. Runtime is on the long side at 1 hour and 50 minutes, but it's pretty interesting and weird stuff. And yes, the Litchi fruit does make an appearance at one point. This is a cool little flick. I recommend it. Now, of course, since it's directed by Eisuke Naito, it's kind of difficult to find. You know what I mean? So, I don't even know if it's available on Region 2 DVD. But if you find Dorome 1 and 2, girls' side and boys' side, maybe the same website you find it on, we'll have Litchi Hikari Club. There's a few movies tonight that we're covering that are tough to find. Just a heads up, but that's the way it is now. That's the way it is now with some Japanese horror films. All right, we're sticking with Japan. We're sticking with Japan. It's another one that I think is pretty good. It is called The Stare, also known as Nozokime, or The Peeping Eye, Japanese horror film. Ayano works as a TV broadcasting station. She covers the mysterious death case of a young man who suffered from asphyxiation and had mud shoved down his throat, reminiscent of Shinya Tsukamoto's film Gemini, if you've seen that one. There's a death scene in that movie that happens. Before he died, he said that somebody was watching him. Covering the case, Ayano realizes that the mysterious eye is also coming after her. So near the beginning, we realize that our protagonist is disenchanted with her job. She seems to find it rather dull, not what she expected. Overall, this is kind of a commonplace story, moves deliberately, but the mythos surrounding the creepy eyes is kind of nuanced. You know, these peeping eyes can look at you from even the most minuscule of locations. The non-horror scenes have legitimately good quality, I think. That includes the acting, the direction, the sound design. They're all pretty good here. I like the use of silence, bell sounds, and a faint, ominous score. This does not rely on jump scares. There are a few here and there, but it's not the main horror set pieces here. The horror sequences in general, a little bit of a mixed bag, but generally good. We see the weird eyeball early on through the opening of a mail chute, so it's like, yeah, it gets pretty freaky. The opening death scene is a little bit disappointing because they didn't show enough of it. It cuts away before much of anything happens. That does happen a few more times. I did not like that aspect. On the other hand, there's a cool eyeball scene in a forest, a sufficiently macabre dismembered corpse shot, and a scene of self-mutilation. So there is some pretty good stuff in here. There are a few CGI images that are used for a few seconds each. At times I thought that they should have cut those out in favor of physical effects, but they are occasionally used for some unorthodox scares. So I will say that the use of CGI for eyeballs, it's slightly goofy, but again, Japan likes doing this stuff in some of their horror films where they have like that spooky kind of vibe that's a mix between goofy and creepy. You get a little bit of that in this. The ending is good though. I think it satisfied me. Overall, I like the film. Fans of Japanese horror films in particular may enjoy this. And do not get it confused with the film Stare, also known as Shirai-san from 2019. That's a better film than this. Kind of a similar premise, but different. You know what I mean? But, hey, if you check this one out, I think it's pretty good. And it's available on Region 2 DVD. Probably no subs, though. You only got 2 left. Only 2 left here. Next one's pretty fun. It's called Bloody Chainsaw Girl, Japanese action comedy horror film. A chainsaw-wielding high school girl battles against a demented classmate named Nero, who transforms schoolgirls into zombie cyborgs. Yes. Conflict arises when Nero kidnaps a little kitty cat and transforms it into a zombie cyborg cat, which earns the ire of her classmates. After getting beat up and made fun of, Nero vows to perfect her experiments and get revenge. So this place takes place entirely on school grounds. It creates a funny dynamic because a small semblance of academics continues to exist despite this completely ridiculous situation. So despite the fact that zombie cyborgs are running around campus or the school grounds, classes are still in session, folks. They're still in session, and that adds some humor, obviously, to the situation. The lead actress in this movie is quite funny. She talks in like a tough guy voice and has some great facial expressions, some really funny mannerisms. The actress who played Nero is good too. Dialogue contributes some chuckle-worthy moments throughout. For example, our protagonist refers to her enemies at the school as, quote, trendy poser mutant cyborgs, unquote. And she says it like, the way she says it's pretty funny. Even the opening credits are kind of humorous in an awkwardly stylish manner. And the reanimated cat scene is pretty funny as well. I chuckled quite a bit while watching this film. It's a low-budget movie, but it has like this tongue-in-cheek attitude that works. Some of the death scenes are entertaining. Within the opening 10 minutes, you should know what you're in for this. A girl gets hit by a bike and smashes her face into a bloody pulp. And the way they do it is just, it makes you laugh. A fight commences and we get bloody dismemberment and decapitation, some of which uses practical effects. A lot of it is CGI, though. The attack scenes are B-movie quality, but sufficiently entertaining in how they're constructed. So it's similar in some ways to like those Sushi Typhoon movies, like Machine Girl, that type of thing. And not as good as those, I don't think. But it's kind of in that vein, you know what I mean? Maybe even a little bit more comedy-based. The chainsaw itself is pretty cool looking, man. It's pretty intimidating, too. And there are a few surprise accessories. A little bit of nudity, nothing excessive. A few panty shots, but, I mean, if you've seen enough Japanese films, you should be used to those by now. Pacing's pretty fast, but the limited locations make a few scenes seem a little bit drawn out. And it's only 75 minutes long, easy sit. I think this one's pretty easy recommendation. I think a lot of people would probably like this if they saw it. It's on YouTube, and I think it's still floating around on DVD as well. All right, last film of the night. This film is a little bit more of kind of an art house film, an art house horror film, I guess you could say, and that's called Dearest Sister, a Laotian horror drama. So a young woman named Nok is sent to care for Anna, a blind relative who's been having scary supernatural visitations. Nok tries her best to keep the ghosts from harming her cousin until she realizes that she can use the spirits to rise above her station financially. As Nok and Anna's relationship changes, the horror shifts from ghouls to greed, capitalism, and the class divide. So this was directed by Maddie Doe, who previously directed Chantilly, which I covered before in this playlist. Dearest Sister is another very low-budget project for her, but she gets the most out of these movies. And like her last film, this is a very drama-heavy horror film, with the horror elements serving as a complementary aspect. We get the same lead actress as Chantilly as well. It was nice to see her again. I like her. The environment in this house is pretty intimidating, all right? There's this Estonian husband who's a major jerk, constantly insulting Anna and her friend and her parents. And the housekeeper is a horrible woman. I was hoping someone would punch her in the freaking face, man. She's terrible. Miserable household. So there's definitely a stress, a sense of tension, dramatic tension in this film. And a lot of the people in town look down on our protagonist because she's from a rural, poorer area. Now, our protagonist seems like a little bit of a nicer person, but she's got a bad habit of stealing things. You know what I mean? And the corruption of her character is a foundational theme of this film. Scare tactics are on the light side. You're not going to get a lot of visceral scares in this one. All right, and if you've seen this director's last film, you should expect, you'll know what you're getting into. I would say some of the scares are maybe vaguely similar to The Eye, with the ghost being shown like as fuzzy shapes in the background. Not as intense as The Eye, of course, but there's some vague similarities there. But it works, given the style of the film overall, because this has a dramatic intensity to it. Finale is legitimately suspenseful and a little bit unexpected. I did not expect that to happen. Pretty impressive little plot turn, I think. Pacing is on the slow side here. You got to be patient. But the overall quality of the film, I think, is quite good. So check this one out. And unbelievably, a Laotian horror film is widely available on the internet. It's on Shudder right now. Very popular website, streaming site. So you can check it out there. And that concludes part 3 of our journey through Asian horror films released in 2016. Got some interesting stuff. Some of the interesting stuff is the harder to find stuff, unfortunately, like the Eisuke Naito films. But, hey, Bloody Chainsaw Girl, people will probably like that one. They probably will. And it's almost like you have to watch Sadako versus Kayako out of obligation if you're a fan of those two franchises. But, yeah, there's some decent stuff in this. But part 4 is our last section of 2016, and we're going to cover the best Asian horror films from that particular year, 2016. And this was a top-heavy year. So we're going to get to some really good stuff in part 4. Some newer classics, for sure. And maybe even a few films that flew under your radar, I think. So it's going to be a good one. So, as always, we will see you next time.